Revenue split gap. Boxing stars and UFC stars both bleed in the ring, but when the fight's over, the paychecks look like they came from two different planets. Just ask AnthonyJoshua and NateDiaz. At UFC 196, NateDiaz and ConorMcGregor tore the house down. The event pulled in about $80 million, a monster haul by any standard. So, what did Diaz walk away with? Around $620,000. McGregor made about $1 million, marking UFC's first ever $1 million payday. Not bad, unless you happen to glance across the street. Just a year later, AnthonyJoshua and WladimirKlitschko threw down in front of 90,000 fans at Wembley. Their fight generated about $62 million, less revenue than UFC 196. Yet, Joshua and Klitschko split a cool £30 million, or roughly $34 million between them. Let that sink in. UFC 196 earned more than Joshua Klitschko, but the fighters in the boxing match made around 14 times more than Diaz and McGregor combined. In boxing, this is normal for elite fighters to collect nearly half of all the money their fight generates. UFC fighters? They're looking at about 15 to 20% on average. Free market versus monopoly. The reality of the matter is, boxing is chaos, and that's exactly why boxing stars get paid. Look around. Boxing is a mess of promoters, sanctioning bodies, networks, and titles. There's no one boss calling the shots, which means fighters can play the field. Don't like what Eddie Hearn's offering? Call Top Rank. Want a better deal? Al Heyman's line is open. This free-for-all turns every big fight into a high-stakes bidding war. Promoters and networks fall over themselves to throw piles of cash at fighters just to secure an event. And guess who benefits the most? The fighters. Now take a peek at UFC's world. One promotion, one decision maker, one contract. Dana White and the UFC have a stranglehold on MMA in the West, locking up about 80 to 90% of the market. There's nowhere else for a UFC fighter to go if they want to be in the spotlight. Sure, Bellator exists, and one championship is hanging in there, but neither offers the same prestige, exposure, or pay-per-view muscle. That monopoly means UFC fighters have almost no leverage when it's time to negotiate. If a UFC star demands a payday like Canelo's, good luck. The UFC simply shrugs and moves on to the next hungry fighter in line. The Jake Paul effect. The fact that Jake Paul, yes, the YouTuber turned boxer, makes more money in a single fight than most UFC champions tells you everything you need to know. Paul had fought exactly 3 professional bouts when he took on TyronWoodley in 2021. How much did Jake pocket? Around $2 million, plus a cut of the pay-per-view sales, pushing his total haul to about $5 million. And Woodley? The former UFC welterweight champ earned $2 million himself, a bigger payday than most of his UFC title fights combined. Meanwhile, UFC champions were out here grinding title defenses for base salaries between $500,000 and $1 million, plus modest win bonuses and sponsorship scraps. Jake Paul didn't get there because he was a better fighter. He got there because boxing's structure let him negotiate directly, own part of the show, grab sponsorships, and collect a juicy slice of the pay-per-view pie. Even Paul has pointed out the irony, calling out UFC and Dana White publicly on fighter pay, tweeting receipts that show he's cashing bigger checks than top-ranked MMA stars. Sponsorship freedom. If you've ever watched a boxing match, you know the trunks tell the story. Logos everywhere. From Dior to Dolce & Gabbana, luxury brands line up to slap their name on a fighter's shorts. And they pay handsomely for the privilege. In boxing, sponsorships can stack up fast. Fighters negotiate their own deals and turn their gear into a personal billboard, sometimes pulling in 6 or even 7 figures from sponsors alone. Now jump over to UFC. Sponsorship money, basically gone. Before 2015, UFC fighters could cut their own sponsorship deals. Companies like Monster Energy, Bud Light, even niche brands would pay fighters directly to wear logos on fight night. Some fighters made more from sponsors than from their actual UFC paychecks. Then came the Reebok deal. The UFC signed an exclusive uniform agreement with Reebok, banning fighters from wearing any outside logos. Even champs were capped at tiny payouts. The most a UFC fighter could earn from the Reebok deal, around $40,000 per fight, regardless of their star power. Today, it's the same story with Venom. The UFC's current deal pays a similar capped sponsorship bonus. Small change compared to what boxing stars pocket from their sponsors. This one rule alone cost UFC fighters millions over the years. UFC rankings control. In boxing, the rankings are messy, but at least they're independent. Multiple organizations like the WBC, IBF, and WBA all maintain their own lists of contenders. Promoters don't get to decide who's ranked where. Fighters can jump between promotions and still rise through the ranks based on performance. The UFC, whole different game. UFC rankings are controlled by UFC itself. Sure, there's a rankings panel, but the UFC ultimately calls the shots on matchmaking, rankings, title shots, everything. That means if a fighter falls out of favor with the company, their path to the top can suddenly vanish, no matter how many wins they stack up. Look at Leon Edwards. He won fight after fight, racking up one of the best streaks in the welterweight division, and still got sidelined for years before finally getting his title shot. In boxing, a hot contender can demand a shot at a champion just by being ranked at the top by an independent sanctioning body. In UFC, it depends on what Dana White wants and whether your name sells pay-per-views. Brand control. Boxing stars don't just fight for belts, they fight for their brands. Canelo, Fury, Joshua. Their names aren't just attached to their fight records. They're businesses. They sell merch, cut sponsorship deals, launch tequila brands, endorse watches. Whatever they want, whenever they want. Their image belongs to them. In UFC, fighters don't really own their image. When a fighter signs a UFC contract, they also sign over significant rights to the company itself. UFC controls fighter likenesses, controls merchandise, controls how their image is used on posters, t-shirts, action figures, even video games. Conor McGregor is probably the one fighter who's come close to breaking that mold, thanks to his massive fame and smart business moves outside the octagon. But even he was subject to UFC's iron grip while under contract. And that's not all. UFC merchandise sales benefit UFC more than the fighter whose face is plastered on the hoodie or hat. Fighters don't get big royalties when a fan buys their shirt at the arena gift shop. Compare that to boxing, where fighters license their names and likenesses independently and rake in cash on merch and branding. In the UFC, the company is the brand. In boxing, the fighter is the brand. Bargaining power. When a boxer becomes a star, they don't just negotiate, they start a bidding war. If a fighter like Tyson Fury isn't happy with what Bob Arum offers, Eddie Hearn is ready with a bigger check. No promoter owns the market. No single company controls who fights where. Boxing's chaos gives top fighters real leverage. That's why Canelo Alvarez can jump from DAZN to PBC for $35 million a fight. Promoters and broadcasters scramble for stars because those stars drive pay-per-view sales, ticket gates, and global attention. Now look at UFC fighters. Bargaining power? Nearly zero. The UFC is the show. If a fighter doesn't like their contract, there's nowhere else to go that offers the same prestige or exposure. Sure, Bellator or PFL might make an offer, but they can't compete with the UFC's visibility or marketing muscle. This lack of alternatives tilts every negotiation. UFC fighters can ask for more money, and sometimes they'll get a raise, but there's no rival promotion forcing UFC to seriously compete for their services. In boxing, promoters compete for fighters. In UFC, fighters compete for a shot at the UFC, and UFC knows it. That's why even the UFC's biggest names have far less negotiating power than their boxing counterparts. Fighters as businesses versus employees. Don't see Canelo Alvarez as just a fighter. He's a one-man empire. When he steps into the ring, he brings his own team, negotiates his own purse, takes a cut of pay-per-view sales, and sells his name like a brand. He's the show. Now glance over at UFC stars. Even the biggest names are more like high-profile employees than independent businesses. They show up, fight under UFC's rules, wear UFC's uniforms, promote UFC's events, and the company dictates the terms of almost everything. The structural difference here couldn't be bigger. In boxing, the promoter works for the fighter. Promoters like Eddie Hearn or Bob Arum have to lure fighters with big guarantees and marketing promises because the fighters can walk away anytime. In UFC, the fighter works for the promotion. UFC holds the contracts, books the fights, approves the matchups, manages the branding, and dictates the schedules. Even Conor McGregor, arguably UFC's biggest star, couldn't break free from this system while he was under contract. His record-breaking payday came only when he stepped into boxing's world to fight Floyd Mayweather. Boxing lets stars act like entrepreneurs. UFC treats stars like contractors punching a clock. That difference shapes every dollar, every fight, and every fighter's career, fighter activity and burnout. A top-level boxer can fight once a year and still take home an 8-figure paycheck. Tyson Fury, one fight in 2022, earned over $30 million. In UFC, that pace won't cut it. UFC stars are expected to fight often. 3 or 4 fights a year isn't unusual for contenders trying to stay relevant and cash checks. Even some champions have to defend their belts twice a year just to stay on the radar and keep their income flowing. The reason? UFC fighter contracts don't come with mega fight paydays baked in. A fighter like Kamaru Usman could be defending his belt and still earning around $500,000 to $700,000 as a base purse, with some bonuses sprinkled on top. So while a boxer can sit out, train carefully, and wait for one big payday, UFC fighters often have to grind through multiple fights just to stack up a fraction of that money. MMA is brutal. Small gloves, no standing counts, knees, elbows, grappling, submissions, all combining for a high risk of injury and short career spans. That means UFC stars fight more often, absorb more damage, and still come out behind financially when compared to elite boxers. Pay-per-view cuts. When a major boxing fight is announced, the headline isn't just who's fighting, it's who's getting paid. Boxing stars don't just show up for a purse. They often negotiate a fat slice of the pay-per-view pie. Mayweather built his fortune this way. He called it easy work because he wasn't just fighting opponents, he was fighting for revenue control. In 2015, Mayweather versus Pacquiao generated over $400 million in PPV revenue. Floyd reportedly walked away with around $250 million that night. A payday almost unthinkable in any other combat sport. In UFC, fighters don't see those numbers. Even UFC's biggest pay-per-view stars like Conor McGregor get nowhere near boxing-style revenue splits. The UFC's business model is designed so that the UFC itself takes the lion's share. Fighters may get a discretionary cut or bonus from PPV sales, but it's tiny compared to boxing's standard. For most UFC fighters, pay-per-view numbers matter a lot. For the company, not for them. Their contracts don't automatically entitle them to revenue sharing. In boxing, the fighters are the reason fans buy PPVs, and they get paid like it. In UFC, the promotion brands itself as the main attraction and cashes most of the checks. That's why boxing stars can earn tens of millions from a single night, while UFC fighters often walk away with a flat purse and a bonus, no matter how many fans tuned in. MuhammadAli Act. This is the law in boxing that changed everything. Passed in 2000, this federal law was designed to protect boxers from the shady promoter-manager relationships that dominated the sport back in the 90s. Think Don King-style control, where the promoter, manager, and sanctioning bodies were all tangled up, deciding rankings, matchups, and fighter pay. The Ali Act forces transparency. Promoters must disclose how much money they're making and how much is going to fighters. Even more important, sanctioning bodies ranking fighters must stay independent from promoters trying to line their pockets. This structure creates separation. Promoters can't rig the rankings to benefit their own fighters or block out rivals. It helps boxers negotiate across the open market and drives up their pay. Now here's the twist. None of this applies to UFC. The Ali Act covers boxing only. UFC fighters don't have these protections, and UFC doesn't have to disclose revenue splits always, or keep rankings separate from its matchmaking decisions. UFC controls it all: who's ranked, who fights, who gets a shot, and how much everyone gets paid. That difference matters. The Ali Act forces boxing's chaos to stay at least somewhat fair for the fighter. In UFC, no such guardrails exist. The company sets the rules, ranks the fighters, and keeps its financial cards close to the chest. And that's it. So here's the real question to you. If a YouTuber like Jake Paul can walk straight into boxing and out-earn almost every UFC star, how long do you think it will take before more fighters start chasing paydays outside the octagon? Share your thoughts in the comments section below, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more amazing videos like this one.